Next up, we have Garrett Wilson, the wide receiver out of Ohio State, who is an interesting player for me to have graded, right? And I'm sure everybody's already freaking out initially at the second round grade. Just to add some perspective to the 80.34, as of right now, currently with the 80 guys that I've graded to this point, he's 24th overall. So even though that number technically is a second round grade, anything for me underneath 82.5 is a second round grade. He's still right in that in that first round conversation, even if I was picking, right? And that's what these grades are at the end of the day. How confident am I in these players, and where would I feel comfortable selecting them? And for me, even though Garrett Wilson is certainly very talented, I just don't quite think I see the top 10 discussion that I've heard a lot, top 15, wide receiver one, etc., etc. For a variety of reasons. First and foremost, for me, I would say the number one thing would be his size. I had questions about that. I just don't really know where he is a natural fit at the next level. He's on the smaller side in terms of being 5'11", 183 pounds. He played a little bit stronger than that on tape. I'll say, like, he looked bigger, played bigger than his size, but at the same time, I don't necessarily think he played big enough to be a outside receiver necessarily. Out there, he's going to be, I don't want to say dwarfed by cornerbacks, but he's not going to have the size advantage that you necessarily want on those outside wide receiver positions. I don't necessarily think he's going to have an athleticism advantage either on those CB1s and CB2s. Besides his 40-yard dash, he really didn't test particularly well. He had a 4.38 40-yard dash, which we'll talk about that in one of my notes. My first note here is not seeing elite speed flashing on tape like at Combine. That was the number one thing I wrote. So we'll touch on that in a little bit. But, some of the other tests, the 36-inch vertical, it's good. At the wide receiver position, that's in like the 70 percentile from what I understand. 10 foot 3 inch broad, that's fine. But then a 4.36 shuttle, which is in the bottom 32 percentile of all wide receivers that have participated at the Combine, which that's not necessarily good either. So maybe he's quick straight line according to those numbers, but past that, not necessarily the most explosive or agile guy. Now, I thought the tape showed a little bit differently, but just in terms of the raw projection numbers, I don't necessarily know if that's a guy that you want in the slot either. So there's some concerns, I would say, just off the bat about where he's going to play. In terms of my grade itself, where did I dock him? Where did I praise him? The first spot was route running. I gave him a 17 out of 20. I thought he did a really good job of just playing the chess game, right? He was constantly in the heads of opposing DBs, and you could just see it, right? He was doing a great job, whether it was with his eyes, just looking people off and, making them think he was running something other than he actually was, whether it was with his feet, obviously, in terms of jab stepping, slowing his tempo down, things of that nature, or, really just anything. He was very solid in terms of confusing defensive backs, attacking their blind spots, making them flip their hips unnecessarily and commit to, again, like I said, the wrong route. Just a lot of good stuff like that. I did think at times, though, he could kind of telegraph where he was going, right? Like he would, he'd fling his right arm up in the air when he was about to tempo down and cut left, just by example. That was something that popped up a couple times. Same with his left hand when he was cutting the opposite way. And that would kind of give defensive backs, even though they maybe thought initially he was running something else, that would kind of key them in a little bit in terms of where he was going. It just felt like he sometimes telegraphed things. In terms of the speed and quickness, I already mentioned it. I gave him a 13 out of 15, which isn't a bad grade at all. It actually might have, from my observations, maybe I should have went a little bit lower personally, but I just didn't think the speed was there, especially on like a vertical basis, He ran very few, if any, just pure straight vertical routes in the 6 games that I watched of him. And obviously there were some better athletes on the team, right? In terms of Chris Olave, the sophomore JSN wide receiver, number 11. They had some other guys who were maybe better at those things, but I don't necessarily think that it was Garrett Wilson being held down by the talent around him. I just didn't think it was something he would be necessarily good at based on based on the acceleration that I was seeing on tape, the speed I was seeing on tape. And even though, he could confuse guys on some of these deep routes, say a post route where he makes the DB think it's a corner, that's great and all, but on the flip side, in terms of just the raw speed to roast a guy, I didn't quite see it. I thought in terms of his hands, generally good. Like I said earlier, stronger than his frame, I would think, looked, and that persisted into his hands in terms of being able to just pluck the ball out of the sky. At the same time, it felt like there were some unnecessary concentration drops, right? Plays where he just wasn't focused, or maybe already looking ahead to what he was going to do on the ground as a runner. As transitioning into that category, I thought that was one of his better areas. Just the rack ability in terms of transitioning from receiver to runner, getting vertical, and making guys miss. I thought, despite like the shuttle time and whatnot that I talked about earlier, just there was a little bit of short area quickness to where he could, he could get you to miss. He was willing to put his shoulder down. He was a tough guy to tackle. Was more than willing to fight for extra yards. And in that regard, I gave him an 8.25 out of 10. I thought he was very solid there. I also thought he was good, as I mentioned a little bit already, in terms of plucking the ball out of the sky. For me, that goes a long way in the tracking and body control grade. I gave him an 8.75 out of 10, right? So even though I said second round grade, there are a lot of very good traits here. His release, I was a little bit hesitant on, because he was getting a lot of very free releases, just based on his alignment and some of the things OSU was doing with him. Like I said, if you expect him to play out on the outside, I would probably drop his release score a little bit, because I'm not necessarily sure how he would be able to handle press coverage on a play-to-play basis, or on a consistent basis at all, for that matter. Not even necessarily play-to-play. I think being inside, where there's kind of a built-in cushion, I think that might be better for Wilson. I gave him a decent grade in blocking and physicality. Nothing to write home about, 3.5 out of 5. And then I gave him a low mark on size and a generally solid 3.75 out of 5 on athleticism, which, again, that's more going off the combine score than anything else, but I personally probably would have went a little bit lower if it was my observational grade, but I like to use those final two categories as like a catch-all, just raw, what do the numbers say, And there you go. That comes out to an 80.34. I didn't think that was necessarily the most unreasonable thing in the world, just compared to some of his peers that a lot of people seem to have him higher than. I might have been higher on them, if that makes sense. So I don't think he's a bad player at all. I just don't quite think that I'm seeing what everybody else is, in terms of, I've seen people say, like, oh, he's going to be the next Jamar Chase. Completely different play styles. I don't really see that at all. I saw people saying he'll be the next Justin Jefferson, and maybe there's more similarities in their game, but I don't see that level of athleticism personally out of Garrett Wilson. And in that regard, I have him as of the wide receivers that I've done in this class, which aren't that many. He's currently my wide receiver 4, but I'm still finalizing like Trayvon Burks and a couple other guys in that sort of next tier, Sky Moore, guys like that. So he could be wide receiver 5, wide receiver 6 by the time all is done. But as of right now, wide receiver 4. I don't think that's the wildest thing I've ever heard, but it is perhaps a little bit lower than most people might have him. So with that being said, if you enjoyed, if you agreed, I know you probably didn't in this one, but regardless, I'd appreciate the thumbs up. I'd appreciate the subscribe. And I just appreciate the discussion down in the comment section below. I'd love to hear why you disagree, and what does he do better than I gave him credit for. Do you think he is, say, a better route runner than that 17 out of 20 suggested? Do you think he is faster than the 13 out of 15? Say the hands, was I too harsh on the concentration drops, etc., etc.? I would love to hear your thoughts down below. And where do you think he plays in terms of inside, outside? Does it not matter? That's an interesting question. And, we're getting pretty close to the draft here, so we'll know soon enough what an NFL team thinks, but I'd love to hear what you think, as I said, in the comment section down below. So with that being said, that's all I have for you guys in this one. I'm mic'd up, now I'm mic'ing out. Peace, guys. I'll see you next time.